Hello there. Welcome to this evening's Balliol Online Lecture. My name is Daniel Bart. I'm Fellow and Tutor in Political Theory. It's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Linda Eggert. Dr. Eggert is an early career fellow in philosophy here at Balliol. Her work spans topics in moral, legal, and indeed political philosophy, and mainly addresses issues in normative and practical ethics and theories of justice. Before joining Balliol as early career fellow in philosophy, Linda was an interdisciplinary ethics fellow at the McCoy Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford, a fellow in residence at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, and a technology and human rights fellow with Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And her subject today, the title of her lecture is Ethics, AI, and the Right to a Human Decision. So I'll hand over to Linda in just a moment. Then at the end, there's time for some questions and we hope answers. You can submit your questions at any point during the lecture or at the end of the lecture, whichever you prefer. And you do that by clicking on the Q&A button that you can hopefully see on your screen. And you can also upvote the questions of other people if you think they've asked a particularly good question. So there we are, looking forward to this very much. And I'll hand over now to Linda.
Thank you very much, Dan, and hello, everyone. I'd also like to thank Richard Norman, Dave Barker, and Amy Lamb, the brilliant team from the Development Office, for all of their work, which in Richard's case actually included devising a topic, title, and description for this talk, and in Dave's case, enormous patience. So that was very important to say. The aim of this lecture is to offer a perspective from moral and political philosophy on a question of, I think, some contemporary urgency: how to justify a right to a human decision. And I was instructed to tell you about this research project on the assumption that most people here mainly do things other than philosophy. So this is a talk about a philosophy research project, but not for a specialist audience, which means if you are a philosopher, you might want to leave, and you're very welcome to email me for the actual paper, as is anyone else. So for the context of this topic, I should say that I'm not a philosopher of technology or an AI ethicist, whatever that means. Most of my work, as Dan said, is in moral and political philosophy, and I work mainly on ethics. I'm especially interested in what's known as non-consequentialist ethics. And so that's questions of what considerations other than consequences determine the rightness or wrongness of our actions. But like anyone who's wary of the ways in which AI has taken over our lives, determining what we read, where we go, who we date, how much of reality we see, whether we get a donor organ, whether we're sent to jail, I found it pretty difficult to escape questions that I think have a claim on all of our attention about the ways in which AI has come to shape our lives. And so the capacity in which I engage with issues raised by AI is, I think, the same in which many of us at Balliol try to be responsive to the big questions of our time. And so I've become preoccupied with the relationship between AI, human rights, and democracy, and with what we owe to one another as we make AI more powerful and more prevalent. And I'm also interested in the ethics of delegating decisions to AI, how we should think about what sorts of tasks and decisions to delegate and which ones to reserve for human agents. Which brings us to our topic for today. The topic is a right to a human decision. And the question I'm interested in is, why might we care about whether we have such a right to begin with? And here's why, at least I think, it's both interesting and important. So virtually every commentary on anything to do with AI ethics starts with some acknowledgement that AI now penetrates most areas of human activity. And almost every commentary includes some version of the sentence: machine learning algorithms are used to make decisions about people that seriously affect their lives. Decisions like whether a person is admitted to university, whether they're hired for a job, whether they're sent to jail. the list goes on, and you can find lots of examples. Now, in discussions about this, both in public and in academic scholarship, it's becoming increasingly common to appeal to notions like human oversight, keeping the human in the loop, meaningful human control, or appropriate levels of human judgment, particularly in the military context, and indeed, more generally, a right to human decision. And that idea has already started to make its way into the law. For example, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, includes language that's meant to protect people from decisions based solely on automated processing. And according to legal scholars, that's a broader trend. So the expectation is that more and more jurisdictions will recognize the importance of human decision-making and what's increasingly commonly referred to as a right to human decision. And there's an emerging body of mostly legal scholarship on this, but at least so far, there hasn't really been that much philosophical treatment of the matter. And that's where some of my work, and indeed much of the work that happens here at the Institute for Ethics in AI, comes in. So what I'm interested in is one of the most basic fundamental questions in this area, which is what could ground, how might one justify a right to human decision? And that's not the same as asking, is there a moral right, or should there be a legal right to human decision? The question I'm interested in here is, what reasons might there be for defending such a right in the first place? So what reasons do we even have to care about whether such a right could exist? And so what I want to focus on is exploring the moral basis for such a right. And that might sound a bit abstract and theoretical, and not like something that's of obvious, practical significance, but I think it's actually really interesting. And there's, I think, at least two different reasons for asking the question, how a right to human decision could actually be justified. The first reason is that it's important to know not just what our values and principles are, but also why we hold them. In particular, I think we need to be clear about whether the right to human decision matters to us instrumentally for other goods and rights it might help to promote, or whether it matters for its own sake. Because if we find that the right to human decision matters not for its own sake, but just to promote other rights and extrinsic values, then it means that the justification for that right will be contingent, so dependent on circumstances that might change. And then it's possible that what we really want isn't actually a right to human decision, but what the legal scholar Aziz Huq calls a right to a well-calibrated machine decision. So that's the first reason why this matters. Answering the question helps us clarify our ends, what we want, what's ultimately at stake. And all these common calls for human oversight, human control, human decision, and so on. And so part of the aim in bringing moral and political philosophy to bear on this issue is to make our normative commitments more explicit. Okay, that was the first reason. The second reason is that there are also possible practical implications because, well, if it turns out that this asserted right ultimately has no moral ground to stand on, and that a bias towards human decision-making is actually unjustified, if it turns out that using AI will somehow better promote the values that we care about, then a right to human decision isn't actually something that we can appeal to in trying to make sense of the moral and social implications of algorithmic decision-making and devising laws and justifying regulation. So that's why I think this matters. There's something at stake. Okay, I take it that the view that high-stakes decisions that will significantly affect people's lives should be limited to human agents isn't just widely shared, but also pretty intuitive. And so my aim isn't to argue for a view that everyone already agrees with anyway. My interest really is in whether we can trust this instinct and in helping us better understand what kinds of normative commitments a right to human decision might presuppose. And for the purpose of this lecture, my aim isn't to kind of just give you an argument to convince you of my own view, but mainly to offer a few different positions, different approaches, starting points to stimulate discussion, whether here in the Q&A or indeed for holiday, party, small talk, or dinner conversation. And there's basically two broad things that I'd like to suggest. First, although I think we can find adequate support for right to human decision, I think the justification for this might not look like one might have expected. And in particular, I think a robust defense of a right to human decision might, in a sense, give us more than we bargained for. So in defending a right to human decision, we might actually end up having to defend a bunch of things that we didn't actually set out to defend. So if you want to defend a right to human decision, you might need to be willing to defend certain other commitments, whether you thought you had them or not. And my second broad claim is that by a right to human decision, maybe we should really mean a right to a non-algorithmic decision. Because humans can execute algorithms just like machines. And what we really care about, I think, is that certain decisions aren't made just by following an algorithm. So simply put, it's not just about who makes the decision, whether it's made by a human or a non-human artificial agent, but about how the decision is made. And certain ways of reasoning can't be algorithmically represented. And that's ultimately what grounds a right to human, specifically non-algorithmic decision-making, or at least that's what I want to suggest for the purpose of discussion. And more broadly, I think this means that there's a possibility that there are at least two rather different things at stake. The first possibility is that sometimes what's paramount is that a decision is made by a human, whether they follow an algorithm is neither here nor there. And the second possibility is that what's paramount is that a decision is made non-algorithmically. And that is part of the reason why it matters that a human makes it. So there might be very different reasons for wanting to preserve human decision-making in certain contexts. Okay. Now, anyone who's been to a philosophy talk will know that there's a certain amount of clarifying assumptions, explaining definitions, delineating the scope and so on that precedes the actual argument. And I acknowledged this in another talk in front of a multidisciplinary audience, and just mentioning the practice resulted in collective eye rolling. So in the interest of time and in an attempt to not unnecessarily bore people, I'm not going to do too much outlining of assumptions, definitions, and so on. I'll just mention a few things because it's a pretty broad topic, but I'll keep these clarifications to a minimum. So the first thing I should say is that my concern here is with a moral right rather than a legal right. So very simply put, moral rights don't depend on contingencies, they don't depend on institutions, political recognition and enforcement. So my aim is not to look at existing laws and try to work out if they might be interpreted to imply a right to human decision. But as I said, with what reasons we have to care about the existence of such a right to begin with. And whether a moral right to human decision then also provides a basis for designing institutions to legally protect such a right is, I think, a separate question. And I'm not saying this as a cop-out, because I think when we're thinking about the law, we're dealing with a different question, because we'll have to take into account things like the effects of collective compliance in society. So that's just to say that reasons for having certain laws aren't the same as justifications for moral rights, even if moral rights themselves might be reasons for having certain laws, right? Okay, so the concern is with a moral right, not a legal right. Second, I'm going to set aside questions about the quality of the decision. Because if decisions generated by AI are foreseeably worse, however that's defined, than those made by humans, then all we're really saying is that we want to avoid bad decisions. So part of what I'm interested in is, even if we set aside concerns about the quality of the decision, what reasons might we have for preserving human decision makers? Finally, I promise I'd keep this to a minimum. What's of interest is decisions of a certain degree of moral significance. So, for example, it's not about whether an algorithm can correctly classify a cat as cat and a dog as not cat, but to bring the stakes to the fore, we might just imagine the idea of robot judges, which are becoming an increasingly prominent topic in recent legal scholarship. So the part of the territory that I'm going to map isn't meant to give a comprehensive guide or theory of what decisions should be limited to humans. The focus is really on the reasons we might have for defending a right to human decision, which in a sense is just a small part, but I think an important one of a much, much bigger picture. Okay, so much for really minimal preliminary remarks. So the plan for the remainder of my time is pretty simple. Basically, I'll consider 3 different ways of justifying a right to human decision. The first focuses on human decision subjects, because the most commonly raised concern in this context is dignity. The second approach focuses on epistemic features of the decision maker, and that's where I'll argue, maybe surprisingly, much of the action is, given the potential significance of moral understanding. And then finally, the third approach, if we have time for that, concerns features and requirements of a just society. And that's where democratic values are of special concern. There might well be more potential grounds than are covered by the set of approaches that I consider. And if anyone thinks of any others, I'd love to hear from you. So I'll say just a little bit about each approach and try to clarify what kind of promise each type of justification might hold for grounding a right to human decision. And my aim isn't actually to argue for one approach and then reject the others, but really to offer some observations about different approaches that one might take in trying to justify a right to human decision. And one thing we'll see, I think, in the process is that defending such a right might be a somewhat more involved enterprise than might have seemed at first. Okay, so here's the first cluster of considerations concerning the person who is the decision subject, so the person most immediately affected. And when you ask people what's wrong with being subjected to an automated decision, by far the most common answer is that it violates human dignity. And what makes this claim difficult to assess is that appeals to dignity are often quite vague and hand-wavy. One of my favorite complaints about this is actually from Arthur Schopenhauer, who labeled dignity the shibboleth of all the perplexed and empty-headed moralists who concealed behind that imposing expression the lack of any real basis of morals. But we don't need to go quite as far. We can just start, as lots of people do, with the assumption that dignity captures some worthiness of respect. So very broadly, one basic assumption is that dignity is violated when people are treated as less worthy of moral concern than they really are. And that can happen in all sorts of different ways, only some of which are relevant here. And I'll just paint with very broad strokes. So we can make things a little bit more concrete by considering a few different ways in which a right to human decision is meant to help protect human dignity. And a natural starting point is the Kantian idea that people have what Kant labeled an inner incomparable worth, which effectively implies a certain kind of immunity from being treated as fungible. And simply put, in effect, we must treat people as individuals. Now, one of the things that might trouble us about algorithmic decision-making in general is that it doesn't treat people as individuals. Now, that's one problem with algorithmic bias and discrimination, which is one of the most prominent concerns in the field. So just to illustrate, one of the best known and most widely discussed examples is a certain kind of predictive algorithm, a now notorious recidivism algorithm called COMPAS. Now, very basically, COMPAS is a decision support tool, a classification algorithm that's used to predict the probability of rearrest for detained people if they're released pre-trial. So for context, in many US states, when judges make bail and parole decisions, they look at information including the output of a predictive model that's used to predict whether a defendant poses a public safety risk. And in effect, the prediction helps determine whether people are sent home or to jail. And people predicted to successfully reintegrate into society are given parole and released. People who are predicted to go on to commit violent crimes are sent to jail. Now, given the devastating consequences that come with being sent to jail, from job loss to wrecking families, the consequences of these algorithms' predictions can be life-changing in the worst ways. And a problem is that not all predictions are accurate. So in 2016, ProPublica, an investigative journalism organization, revealed, and I'm radically simplifying here, that false predictions differed significantly between Black people and white people. So that there's huge disparity in that the algorithm falsely labeled Black people as high risk much more frequently than white people. And it falsely labeled white people as low risk much more frequently than Black people. And there's a lot of debate about various aspects of this in the context of the notion of algorithmic fairness. But here I mention it only because it's a very well-known example of one of the things that might trouble us about algorithmic decision-making, which is that it fails to treat people as individuals. Algorithms rely on huge amounts of data and statistical information to make classification decisions on the basis of group-based generalizations. And making a recommendation about a person based on a prediction that's based on other people's past behavior fails to treat that person as an individual. So a proponent of a right to human decision might point out that treating people on the basis of their perceived membership in some larger social group clearly fails to take them seriously as individuals. And decisions that will severely impact people's lives, such as whether someone's sent to jail, should be made on the basis of people's own individual conduct, not on the basis of predictions about what they might do, which are themselves based on other people's past behavior. So a possible claim a proponent of a right to human decision might make here is that people should be treated as individuals, and that's a reason against algorithmic decision-making, which is necessarily based on statistical information, whereas human decision makers can take into account individualized information. Now, that doesn't seem to be the best argument for right to human decision, because what matters is being judged on the basis of relevant information, and problems arise when relevant information is left out, or when people are judged on the basis of things that don't matter. And resulting problems aren't inherent in algorithms, right? Humans are incredibly biased. So a right to human decision might not be an adequate solution to the specific problem of algorithmic bias in mistaken predictions, but not just because people themselves are often biased. Also, more broadly, because one appropriate response to the harmful effects of unavoidable, mistaken algorithmic predictions is that we need to work out how to distribute the costs and the burdens of algorithmic mistakes. So the question is, on whom should the burdens of inevitable and foreseeable mistaken algorithmic predictions fall? And in a sense, that's a question of distributive and rectificatory justice, rather than a matter of a right to human decision. So much for one of the most prominent issues in the field. Here's another cluster of dignity-based considerations. A while ago, Chuck Bites, a political theorist at Princeton, looked at different roles that the idea of dignity plays in philosophical and legal writing about human rights. He found loads of different users of the concept and eventually proposed that we understand the notion as self-directing agency. Now, in the context of prominent worries about automated decision-making, self-directing agency as a potential reason for wanting a human decision maker might take the form of what we might broadly describe as contestation and self-advocacy. So one possibility is that the right to human decision protects our interest in having decisions that affect us be explained or justified to us. And that's the idea of explainability, which is very frequently discussed. And a related thought is that part of why explainability matters is that we want to be able to contest or appeal a decision that affects us. But that's not the only thing. Kate Redenberg, who wrote an important paper on the right to an explanation, for example, argues that what grounds the right to an explanation is actually our interest in self-advocacy. So a proponent of right to human decision might argue that such a right partly protects the interest in explaining oneself to a decision maker, giving reasons that one thinks should play a role in whatever decision is going to be made about one. And the assumption here would then be that one can better exercise this kind of agency, contesting decisions and explaining oneself, if one's interacting with a human decision maker. And just being on the phone with airline customer service robots, I think, is enough to make that sound pretty plausible. But at least contestability, I think, might not actually do much in justifying a right to human decision. Because if what's at stake is just the ability to provide additional information and the option of contesting a machine decision, say having a human decision maker review that decision afterwards, then it seems all we're saying is that there should be a way of appealing a machine decision. And in having someone review it and either explain and justify it to us or reverse and correct it. But justifications and transparency about reasons, I think, offer more promising ground for right to human decision. And I'll come back to that in a bit. First, here's a final, broadly dignity-related consideration that actually points in the opposite direction, and which connects to the philosophy of privacy. There might be situations in which people actually have an interest in not being seen or judged by another person. So Jürgen Habermas and Avishai Margalit, for example, talk about dignity in terms of not being humiliated. And that matters because there might be cases in which people have interest in not being scrutinized and judged by other people. My favorite example here is an AI therapy tool, a text chatbot therapist, that's aptly named Robot, that people apparently find easier to talk to than a human therapist because they don't feel judged. And as usual, when I know something, I asked my students about this phenomenon, and I was informed that chatbots are indeed a popular recourse for people when they're not feeling great and need someone, or rather something, to talk to. So that's just to say that dignity-based considerations aren't as straightforward as one might think. If we try to justify a right to human decision by appealing to dignity-based considerations, then things quickly become quite messy. And the right to human decision doesn't necessarily seem like the right answer to the problem of algorithmic bias and discrimination in the context of mistaken algorithmic predictions, which I argue raise different questions about justice. And there might also be situations in which respecting human dignity actually requires protecting people's ability to avoid being judged by another human. That's not to say that dignity-based considerations are relevant, right? In fact, I'll suggest that there might be a different kind of, well, more robust justification. So that's the first approach, mainly concerned with human decision subjects' dignity. Now, the second approach, to which I'll move now, concerns epistemic features of the decision maker. And that's based on a somewhat less common way of thinking about rights. Now, you might think that it matters not just whether a decision is the right one, but also that was reached for the right reasons. But machine learning basically works by detecting patterns in huge amounts of data and statistical correlations that are the basis of classifications and predictions, and then form the basis of decisions, and not justifications, right? Justifications make reference to relevant reasons, and not all relevant reasons can be captured by statistical correlations. Now, part of the thought here is that what might distinguish human decision makers and what might plausibly ground a right to human decision isn't just the capacity to do the right thing, but the capacity to do the right thing for the right reasons, and with it, the capacity to understand why those reasons are the right ones. And maybe it also matters that human decision makers can want to do the right thing for precisely the reason that it's the right thing to do. And doing the right thing for the right reasons presupposes the ability to act for reasons, which in turn presupposes the ability to recognize reasons as such. In fact, awareness of reasons, awareness of one's reasons when one acts, is essentially what autonomous agency presupposes. And so one relevant notion here, I think, is that of moral understanding. So Alison Hills over at St. John's has written a lot about this. Essentially, knowing that something is the case isn't the same as understanding why something is the case. And when we're dealing with a prescription or a normative claim, I think that difference is especially important. So, for example, if you're a judge sentencing someone to time in prison, being able to justify your decision by appealing to relevant reasons and the ways in which those reasons matter is vital. So the general thought here is that decisions that affect people's lives in certain ways should presume and follow from relevant reasons that have been taken into account. And machine learning algorithms just don't work that way. They're just great at classifications and empirical predictions when enough training data is available. And the more general point here is one about how moral reasoning works. And at least on my view, people disagree about this, is that it's not like following an algorithm. So in my view, moral problems don't presuppose a solution for which we can specify some determinate procedure, an algorithm. It's not about determining some approach in advance and then applying it and throwing it at, whatever problem we encounter. It's a lot messier than that. It's about first trying to work out the moral dimensions of the situation, working out what factors are morally relevant, how they interact, how to weigh them, and then where to go on that basis. And that includes responding appropriately to moral sacrifices involved, even in doing the right thing when trade-offs must be made. It's messy and very complicated, but that's because the world is messy and complicated. And the point is that sometimes I think we should care about more than generating the right outputs. Again, people disagree about this. I'm one of those people who thinks that morality isn't just concerned with bringing certain things about. It's also arguably mainly about how we treat one another. And that involves being considered and treated in certain ways, relating to one another in ways that are appropriate to the kinds of morally relevant beings we are. And that might involve knowing what it's like to be human. Excelling at empirical predictions when sufficient training data is available isn't like that. And one way of fleshing this out is that we want agents to make decisions, at least decisions of a certain degree of moral significance, who understand the gravity of those decisions, who not only decide the right thing, but who decide the right thing for the right reasons. And that means people should figure in deliberations about decisions that will affect them in certain ways. So when decisions affect you in a certain way, as a person with a certain kind of moral status, you should figure in the reasons for or against those decisions. Whether you're harmed or benefited in the end, you want to at least have been taken into account in the right way. Okay. What was the point of talking about moral reasoning? In appealing to this notion of moral understanding, what I'm suggesting is essentially a non-instrumental justification for the right to human decision. And on this approach, the right to human decision is valuable independently of its effects. So the assumption isn't that it's valuable mainly because it helps protect other rights and interests, because it can produce a different outcome in philosopher Tim Scanlon's description. Rather, if what matters is moral understanding, then perhaps the right to human decision just expresses something about us as rights holders, irrespective of any other interests we might have. So it's not about the interests themselves, it's about the worth of the person that makes those interests worth protecting in the first place, to rephrase philosopher Francis Cam. And this, I think, might ultimately also be a more compelling way of thinking about dignity than the considerations that we started with. And ultimately, what this reveals, as I indicated in the beginning, is that there might be a risk of assuming something like a false binary here. Because in many cases, rather than a right to a merely human decision, indicate that perhaps what we should really want is a right against algorithmic decision-making, including possibly by humans. And non-algorithmic decision-making can take lots of different forms. But the basic suggestion I started to make is that what a right to human decision might serve to protect ultimately involves reasoning towards a decision about moral matters, which is different from mechanically following finite series of simple steps or instructions, which just require no real judgment or creativity. Okay, so that was the second approach to justifying the right to human decision. The first was based on decision subject's dignity, and the second one had to do with epistemic features of the decision maker. So here is the final cluster of considerations. And that concerns requirements of a just society, and more specifically, the possibility of grounding the right to human decision in democratic values. So one possibility, you might think, is that a right to human decision is an element of institutional morality, one of the moral principles that should govern the design, the functioning of social institutions and democratic culture. So one thought might be that since part of the point of democracy is that we, as equals, collectively govern ourselves, we should include the right to human decision among those moral principles that guide the design of our democratic institutions and the actions of citizens and representatives. Because replacing human decision makers with AI, at least prima facie, on first impression, seems to undermine the spirit of participatory democratic culture. Now, one general observation here is that different views about the value of democracy might commit us to different positions about what kinds of activities democratic societies might outsource to non-human artificial decision makers, and what, if anything, will lose in doing so. Simply put, whether you think democracy is instrumentally or non-instrumentally valuable might make a difference to what functions you think is permissible to outforce, and what functions ought to be limited to human decision makers. And that in turn might inform your justification of the right to human decision. So for example, to the extent that you think democracy is instrumentally valuable, the permissibility of outsourcing decisions to AI might just depend on the extent to which that would serve those values that you see democracy itself as promoting, be that accountability, transparency, explainability, maybe even equality. And in that case, certain justifications for right to human decision might weaken. Now, if you think human decision-making itself contributes to, or is even constitutive of democracy, then outsourcing decisions to AI will be a lot harder to justify. And so you might have these two different types of democracy-based justifications of a right to human decision. So you might think that the right to human decision is indispensable to realizing certain democratic values, and it's this contributory role that justifies the right. Or you might think that the right to human decision is itself constitutive of democratic governance, just like rights to freedom of thought and expression, and equal participation. Now, they're not mutually exclusive. So to make this a little more concrete, transparency and publicity are important democratic values, right? And you might think that the right to human decision is indispensable to promoting these values. Essentially, justice must be visible, right? We not only have an interest in relating to one another and being treated as equals, but we also have an interest in being able to see and ascertain that we're being treated as equals. So it matters not just that justice is done, but also that it's done visibly. And one thought is that justice and publicity are inextricably intertwined. And as members of society who engage in public deliberation, we disagree. We don't always get the outcomes we want. We at least need to know that our institutions and practices live up to relevant norms and commitments. Because so much of living in a democracy is about publicly justified compromise in light of constant disagreement. And automated decision-making, for example, if you imagine robot politicians, seems to sit rather awkwardly with this publicity requirement, given all kinds of familiar worries about opaqueness, lack of transparency, and explainability of black box machine learning algorithms. So if you think publicity is a requirement for justice, and if the right to human decision promotes transparency and associated values, like explainability, the possibility of appeal, and so on, then one possible justification of the right to human decision is essentially as a precondition for the possibility of important democratic values like publicity. So that's one example of how the right to human decision might contribute to democracy. You might also think that it's constitutive of democracy, because part of the ideal of democracy isn't that it just matters what outcomes we bring about, but how those outcomes are brought about and by whom. And so you might tie the right to human decision into your conception of democracy and basically insist on the intrinsic value of human participation in governance with all its imperfections, even if certain values might ultimately be better promoted by replacing human decision makers with artificial ones. Now, this is a slightly different sense of the right to human decision, because the implicit contrast here isn't just between human and non-human artificial decision-making, but more broadly between doing something ourselves versus outsourcing it more generally. And the basic thought is that outsourcing any part of which should be self-governance, including to non-human artificial agents, would just undermine the very foundations of democratic institutions and the ideal of self-governance. You might think of ideals like relational equality or the value of jury trials. You might think that there's something about being judged by our peers, right? It's all about judging one another as equals who know what it's like to be human. So justified in this way, the right to human decision is itself a conceptual presupposition of democracy, sort of like rights to freedom of thought and expression and equal participation. And so you might think that a right to human decision basically belongs within this category of democracy constituting rights. So it might be constitutive of a certain kind of democratic society in which we stand in certain relationships to each other. Okay, a final consideration in this context is that you might even think that democratic citizens and representatives have special reasons, maybe even duties, to participate in democratic culture. So common examples include the contested duty to vote, civil disobedience, and just general duties of compromise and public justification. And so one possibility you might think is that the state, on democratic grounds, owes people a certain kind of decision-making, and that democratic citizens incur possibly duties on democratic grounds to make decisions themselves about each other. So that's the very broad third approach to justifying the right to human decision. So it might be necessary if we want to realize certain democratic values. And it might be itself constitutive of democracy. Okay. Time to conclude and sum up. I've very quickly sketched 3 rather different approaches, 3 different starting points to justifying the right to human decision. And zooming out, I've suggested essentially 2 things. The first, I think, broadly speaking, is that the most straightforward justifications, and this also reflects how most people think about rights in general, might be instrumental. But these leave open the possibility that maybe better algorithms and more advanced AI systems might get us what we want, because basically then the values that the right to human decision will promote are for the most part extrinsic. And the second thing I've begun to suggest is that a plausible sort of non-instrumental justification based on the human capacity for moral understanding isn't really about the value of compliance with the right to human decision. It might just be more about the expressive value that it would have. It would express something important about people as rights holders, and would say that what renders us distinctive as moral creatures is that we care about doing things for the right reasons, and that part of what we owe to one another involves a certain type of moral concern, figuring in each other's moral reasoning. Going back to the suggestions that I made at the start, I think we can find adequate support for the right to human decision, but it might, as I've indicated, look a bit different from what we might have assumed at first. My second suggestion, as I also indicated at the start, is that there might be this risk of assuming an oversimplified binary. We can't just assume, I think that's what's at issue, is a right not to be subject to an automated non-human decision. Because perhaps what's at issue really is a right not to be subject to purely algorithmic decision-making, including in some cases by humans. With that, I'll conclude, and I'll look forward to people's thoughts. You're also very welcome to be in touch via email and share your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda, for that wonderful talk. You did invite philosophers to leave at the start, but I was watching the participant numbers, and I can tell you that no one left. So, and there are some philosophers here as well. So nice try, but I'm afraid that didn't work. Thank you to all of you for tuning in today. I need to tell you that the next lecture in the series is on Tuesday, the 21st of January. In the new year. Professor Robin Chowdhury, Robin is Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine here at Balliol, and he's giving a talk with the extraordinary title, A Cultural History Told Through Depictions of the Heart, Botticelli to Banksy. So there we are, not to be missed, I think, on the 21st of January. But for now, it just remains for me to once again thank you all for coming, and to thank Linda very much indeed for such a wonderful talk. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all.